Putin's throne is shakier than the media tells you. Not too long ago, something that seemed impossible actually happened. A private army marched toward the heart of Russia, Moscow, openly challenging Vladimir Putin. The leader of that rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, didn't even last 3 months to tell the tale. He died in a plane accident that raised more suspicion than answers. Since then, a chain of events has been shaking the foundations of power in Russia, especially in the last month. Suspicious deaths of people close to the Kremlin, unprecedented economic pressure, attacks on Russian infrastructure, and an opposition that, even in the shadows, keeps resisting. The question everyone asks is, after more than 2 decades in power, is Vladimir Putin finally shaken? Today, we're diving into the facts, analyzing the signs, and trying to understand if the man once considered untouchable might actually be facing the biggest crisis of his political career. To understand whether Putin is really in danger, first we need to see how he built his empire. When he took power in 1999, Russia was basically a failed state. The 90s had been marked by economic chaos, oligarchs running the country like their personal fiefdoms, and a hopeless population watching their former empire collapse. Putin came in promising order, and he delivered, at least on the surface. His success formula was always simple: stability in exchange for freedom. The Russian people accepted less democracy in exchange for more security and prosperity. For years, that worked flawlessly. The power structure Putin created rests on 3 fundamental pillars. The first are the Siloviki, former security agents and military officers who hold key positions in government and state companies. They're not just order takers, they're the hardcore of the regime, people who share the same worldview and the same interests. The second pillar is absolute control of information. In Putin's Russia, state TV controls the narrative, independent websites are blocked, and strict laws punish any speech labeled destabilizing. This created a bubble where the official version of events is rarely questioned in public. The third pillar is institutional: election laws that favor the ruling party, a judiciary aligned with the Kremlin, and mechanisms that make a democratic transition of power practically impossible. These 3 pillars worked like a perfect tripod for over 20 years. But are they still solid? On June 24, 2023, something happened that many experts had considered impossible. A private military force, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, launched a march toward Moscow. The head of the Wagner Group, who had once been one of Putin's closest men, was now openly challenging the Kremlin. The mutiny lasted only 24 hours, but its psychological impact lingers to this day. Prigozhin claimed that the Russian armed forces were lying about the progress of the war in Ukraine, and that the military leadership was betraying both the soldiers and Putin himself. For a few hours, the world watched in disbelief as an armed convoy rolled down the highway connecting Rostov-on-Don to Moscow. What made the event even more shocking was the initial reaction of local authorities and even some military units. In several cities, Prigozhin's forces were received not as invaders, but almost as liberators. Ordinary people handed out food and water to Wagner soldiers, exposing a latent discontent few had imagined existed. The rebellion ended abruptly when Prigozhin announced he had reached a deal with Putin, mediated by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Wagner's leader would go into exile in Belarus, his soldiers would be pardoned, and the crisis would be forgotten. But in Russian politics, deals like this rarely mean permanent forgiveness. Exactly 2 months later, on August 23, 2023, Prigozhin was shot down. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group, was among 10 people killed in a plane crash near Moscow, confirmed by Russian authorities after genetic testing. The coincidence was way too obvious to ignore. The world watched what many interpreted as an execution disguised as an accident. Prigozhin's death wasn't an isolated case. Since 2023, a string of figures connected to the Russian government have died under highly suspicious circumstances. Businessmen who criticized economic policies, ex-officials who questioned military strategy, and even oligarchs supposedly in good standing with the Kremlin. The most emblematic case was Alexei Navalny, Putin's main opponent, who died in a Siberian prison in February 2024. Although Navalny had been imprisoned for years, his death at a moment of growing international pressure raised questions about the timing. The implicit message was clear: even opponents already neutralized weren't safe. These events created a climate of paranoia within Russia's own elites. Private conversations reveal that even people close to the government have started worrying about their own safety. When even allies start fearing for their lives, the regime's stability is in question. International analysts noted that this pattern isn't necessarily a sign of strength. It might actually show the opposite. A truly secure leader doesn't need to wipe out rivals so often. The fact that Putin apparently feels the need to clean house constantly might reveal a growing insecurity about his own position. It's important to note that not all these deaths were necessarily ordered by the Kremlin. Some may have been genuine coincidences or the result of internal disputes between power factions. Still, the overall pattern has created an atmosphere where even natural events are viewed with suspicion. If there's one factor that could really shake Putin's government, it's the economy. Since 2022, international sanctions have drastically reshaped Russia's economic landscape. Even though Putin has managed to keep up a facade of normality, the everyday reality for regular Russians tells a different story. Inflation has soared, especially for imported products that used to be part of daily life. European cars, electronics, medicines, even basic food items have become scarce or insanely expensive. The Russian government tried to replace these with Chinese versions or domestic production, but quality and variety tanked. An even bigger problem has been the targeted attacks on Russian infrastructure. Oil refineries, strategic railways, and export terminals have been frequent targets, causing fuel rationing in some areas and disrupting vital logistics chains. These attacks expose vulnerabilities the government preferred to keep hidden. State resource allocation has also shifted dramatically. A growing share of the federal budget is going into military and security spending, slashing investments in healthcare, education, and civilian infrastructure. This has created a two-tier economy, a military sector flush with resources, and a civilian economy barely staying afloat. To make matters worse, demographics are working against Putin. Military mobilization, combined with battlefield losses and the exodus of young professionals fleeing the country, is shrinking Russia's human capital base. Hundreds of thousands of skilled Russians are estimated to have emigrated since 2022, taking with them technical expertise and productive capacity that will take decades to replace. The economic situation is even more delicate when we consider that Putin's legitimacy has always been built on concrete results. For years, he could tell Russians, maybe you've got less freedom, but you've got more money in your pockets. Once that equation flips, the popular support base inevitably weakens. Even though repression has silenced organized opposition, it hasn't vanished completely. Instead, it morphed. Resistance has become more fragmented, decentralized, and paradoxically harder to control. A significant part of the political opposition went into exile, setting up bases in places like Germany, France, and the US. There, figures like Yulia Navalnaya, widow of Alexei Navalny, keep the flame of resistance alive and push the international community for tougher sanctions. Inside Russia, opposition takes more subtle forms. Local councillors question municipal spending, independent journalists operate via social networks and VPNs, and civic groups document human rights abuses. While these actions might seem small, they keep alive a culture of questioning that the government would rather see extinct. There's also a more radical spectrum of underground groups that, according to intelligence reports, are planning direct actions against government targets. The reality of these groups is murky. Some might be real, others may be exaggerated by the security apparatus itself to justify harsher crackdowns. What matters isn't so much their operational capacity, but what they symbolize. The very existence of narratives of armed resistance shows that a part of the population no longer passively accepts the status quo. For a government that built its legitimacy on promises of order and stability, that's deeply troubling. The most fascinating question about today's Russia isn't whether Putin is facing challenges, he clearly is, but who's really making the big decisions and how those decisions get carried out. The system Putin built works like a series of concentric circles of power. At the center sits the president himself, surrounded by a tight group of ultra-close advisors, many of them lifelong friends or old KGB colleagues. But even within that inner circle, there are tensions and rivalries for influence. The Siloviki, the security and military people, have traditionally supported Putin because he represented their interests. But the prolonged conflict in Ukraine and its economic fallout have started raising internal doubts. Some top-ranking officers are reportedly worried about Russia's growing international isolation and its impact on the country's long-term military capacity. The economic elites, oligarchs, and businessmen who control strategic sectors face an even sharper dilemma. Many made fortunes through ties with the West, and now they see their overseas assets frozen and their businesses collapsing. Publicly, they keep showing loyalty to the government, but privately, some are said to be exploring alternatives. It's important to understand that any change at the top of Russia's pyramid wouldn't necessarily come through a popular revolution or competitive elections. Russian history shows that power transitions usually happen through deals among elites, palace coups, or carefully orchestrated successions. The international factor also weighs in. China has massively expanded trade ties with Russia, but that partnership isn't tension-free. Beijing prefers a stable Russia that can be a reliable source of energy and raw materials, but that doesn't mean it cares who exactly runs the Kremlin. Looking at the near future, Russia experts usually outline three main scenarios, not mutually exclusive and potentially overlapping in unexpected ways. The first is controlled resilience. In this case, Putin and his circle manage to hold on by tweaking internal policies, ramping up repression, and finding new ways to dodge international sanctions. This would demand major sacrifices from a population and deeper global isolation, but could buy a few more years of stability. The price: a Russia increasingly shut off from the world and dependent on authoritarian partners. The second is a negotiated transition. Here, different elite factions, military, business, bureaucrats, quietly coordinate a succession plan that protects their interests. This could mean Putin's gradual exit in exchange for personal security guarantees and legal immunity for his close circle. Pulling off such a transition would require complex coordination and trust between actors who historically distrust each other. The third, more worrying scenario is authoritarian radicalization. Under pressure at home and abroad, the government could double down. More repression, more internal purges, and desperate attempts to whip up popular support through dramatic external moves. This path offers short-term stability, but exponentially raises the risk of even worse crises ahead. A fourth, less likely but not impossible scenario would be sudden collapse. Highly centralized political systems can look solid right up until the moment they crumble. History is full of regimes that seemed unshakable until one specific crisis, economic, military, or legitimacy-related, triggered an irreversible chain reaction. So we're back to the central question: is Putin wobbling? The honest answer is yes, but maybe not in the way many expect. Putin isn't facing a street revolution or a classic military coup. Instead, he's dealing with something potentially more dangerous: a slow but steady erosion of the foundations that hold up his power. Legitimacy based on economic performance is being questioned. The narrative of stability and order was shaken by events like the Wagner mutiny. The unconditional loyalty of the elites is being tested by mounting economic pressure. The system Putin built is paradoxically both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It's strong because it centralizes power and allows quick decisions, but it's fragile because it depends too much on one man and a tiny circle of allies. When the leader of a personalist system starts showing signs of vulnerability, the whole system is called into question. That doesn't mean change is imminent or inevitable. Putin still controls the main levers of power: armed forces, security services, and strategic economic resources. The organized opposition has been effectively neutralized, and the population, though discontent, seems more worried about basic stability than risky political change. But the signs of instability are real and growing. The question is no longer if Putin is vulnerable. He clearly is, but whether the challenges he faces will manage to overwhelm the control mechanisms he built over more than 2 decades. For the world, this means both huge opportunities and huge risks. A Russia in political transition could open doors to more constructive relations and conflict resolution. On the other hand, instability in a country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal is the kind of thing that keeps diplomats awake at night. One thing's certain: Russia in 2025 is no longer the Russia of 2020, and for the first time in his career, Vladimir Putin is facing challenges he can't just repress or ignore. The most dangerous throne in the world may be shakier than it looks, and the consequences of that instability go way beyond Russia's borders. What do you think? Will Putin manage to hold on, or are we watching the first signs of a historic transformation? Drop your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis of the events shaping our world.